I was once in a workshop where an artist informed us that they wouldn't be teaching composition because composition, they said, was personal to every person, and there was no right or wrong for them to teach about composition. And if you've been studying art for some time, this may surprise you. I know it definitely surprised me. This flies in the face of what a lot of us have been taught about things like the golden ratio, rule of thirds, or Edgar Payne's classic book, Composition of Outdoor Painting, which all give us clear guidelines on what we should and should not do to create a, quote, pleasing image. Here are just a few of the things that might sound familiar. Compose in odd numbers instead of evens. Avoid symmetrical compositions. Don't have lines leading out of the painting. Make sure to use mathematical ratios to create a pleasing arrangement. Yet, for every great painting that follows any of these rules, another great painting is going to break the same rules entirely. So, which is it? Do we need to follow the rules, or is painting composition like the Wild West where you can do whatever you want? It's no wonder that we often have a hard time agreeing with other artists on which compositions work and which don't, and feel that these rules must be arbitrary as a result. I'm just thinking about the rule I mentioned about not having movement leading the viewer's eye out of the painting. I can't really think of a time I was looking at a painting I really loved and just felt my eye like whipped out of the composition's frame. I think most of the time I stop looking at a painting, it's because I don't really like it, not because there was some inexplicable movement of the composition that pulled me away from it. Nonetheless, I talked to a lot of painters who have shared with me the information overload they've received, whether that was from being self-taught or learning from a bunch of different artists through workshops and YouTube videos, or even going to any kind of art school. And composition, I think, is one of the big mysteries that people worry about, or makes them feel as though they're being pulled in all of these different directions at once. So today I want to talk about what's helped me and how I was able to stop worrying about breaking the rules, but could also put together guidelines to make sure that my compositions were consistently looking the way I wanted them to. And in doing so, they were able to do their job. They were able to draw the viewer in and speak to them and tell the story that I wanted the painting to tell. And after all, isn't that what we want when we talk about composition anyway? So to this end, the first question I would ask is this: do you know what you want your paintings to look like? In this video, I'm showing you a time lapse of a painting that isn't a complex composition, but one that nonetheless spoke to exactly the elements I wanted to capture in my work. It is another painting of a kitten, and as usual, I'll link the kitten's Instagram page in the description of the video so that you can check her out. And before we go on, I just want to make a really quick note. I know that my previous cat painting videos had some issues where the camera would accidentally switch focus away from the painting and onto my hand, because I happen to have the camera over my right hand, my painting hand, instead of my left. I saw all the comments that came in, and I'm just so sorry about how that impacted the video. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can really do in editing to fix that, but for all videos that I filmed after that one, I made sure to always put the camera on my left. Here you will see the camera is in that same place. This is a painting that was filmed before those videos came out, although I think we just lucked out and didn't have the same sorts of camera issues as I did with the previous videos. So I'm hoping to have avoided this in this video, but just in case, just know that I have the camera on my other side for all videos going forward, so hopefully this will not happen again. Okay, going back to the painting. What drew me to this kitten was actually the image itself on Instagram, where I found it. When I saw the photo, it already looked like a painting to me. And in fact, it looked like the exact kind of painting that I knew I was drawn to and wanted to create. It reminded me of so many Richard Schmid paintings, particularly those of his cat Zorro. It was something about the light and the props and the angle of the viewer relative to the kitten and the kinds of edges that were created in the image. As soon as I saw it, I knew I could paint a painting I would love from it. Now, obviously, I'm talking about a photo that I stumbled upon and as a result went and asked the photographer if I could paint from that image. But the same thing is true if this is an image that you are capturing yourself. Rather than taking a photo and figuring out how to make it into a painting, you should choose a photo that already looks like the painting you want to make. Or even if you aren't relying on photography in your painting from life, you should be able to look at your setup in front of you and see the painting that's going to emerge from it. I think that this is one of the most underrated things you can do to set yourself up for success when painting. Let me share a little bit more. So recently I was talking to a student who loved David Lafell's paintings and wanted to better understand how to set up paintings that looked more like Lafell's. And I realized that one of the most common approaches an artist would take to solving this problem would be to set up any old still life and then sit down and paint, and in doing the painting, try to make it look like a Lafell piece. How exactly, I'm not sure, and I'll elaborate on that in just a moment. So a couple of weeks later, I actually saw an image of one of Lafell's still life setups. And as soon as I saw it, without even seeing who posted it or what they said about it, I knew it was connected to Lafell in some way. I'm going to post a link in the description of the images I'm referring to so that you can see what I'm talking about in case you're curious, because for anyone who knows his paintings, the resemblance is uncanny, and it's really amazing when we can see a reference that is so clear like this, where we can see so obviously the through line between the reference and the final work without ever having seen the actual final work before. But how often does this happen with our compositions? How often do we set up a painting and already see definitively how it checks off the boxes that we're going for in our paintings? How often does our painting reference already look like the painting we want to make? And when it doesn't, what magic are we expecting to emerge from our brushes when we sit down to paint? I think a lot of the time this happens because we aren't actually clear on what it is that we want. This is actually one of the things I talk about in depth in my masterclass, how to get really clear on exactly what style of painting you're most drawn to. What is your unique artistic fingerprint that no one else shares? Once you have a short list of paintings you want to emulate and can see them all together in one place, you'll begin to see the stylistic trends that make up that blueprint. Everything from subjects to color schemes to brushwork to composition. And these are the things that you can start to put into your paintings. Now, specifically relative to composition, you should start to notice things like, are the paintings that I'm inspired by of a single subject? What is our angle as the viewer relative to that subject? Are we looking up at it, down, straight on? How does the eye move through the image? Is the light hard, soft, raking, even, cool, warm, backlit? Does my eye fixate on one place, or does it bounce around between a few objects? What shape is my eye tracing onto the canvas as it moves across the painting? One thing I learned from doing this exercise that I loved about still life was the idea of objects weaving in and out of the composition rather than making a bold, symmetrical, or strongly geometric statement. What about you? What speaks to you? And before we move on, I know you might say, but I don't want to be a cheap imitation or clone or copy of my favorite artists. And don't worry. Unless you only have a single artist you're inspired by, this just won't happen. And even if you did, you're always going to be bringing something that is uniquely you to that equation. You'll always be learning from several artists and bringing your favorite facets of all of their work into your own paintings. So you should be able to learn from the compositions you love while also being able to create things that are entirely new. So if you set up your paintings and don't see the painting emerging from it by the time you're done, it's probably unlikely that you'll come away with the paintings you actually want. And if you want help getting really clear on where you want to take your paintings, I'll include a link to sign up for the masterclass that I mentioned in the description box. So here's my next question. Now that you know what speaks to you, are you planning your paintings to feature the compositional designs you know you're drawn to? This sounds simple, but it's a step so many of us skip so much of the time. One thing that was a huge breakthrough for me was learning that the artists I looked up to often take more time to compose their images than they do to paint them. Masterpieces, or the paintings we are most drawn to, don't generally happen by accident or without a great deal of thought and consideration and effort. And effort isn't often about the painting so much as it is the planning. To this point, some of my favorite painting videos are actually not about painting at all. They're about the artists showing their process of planning rather than their process of painting. So, selecting a model, shopping for an outfit, hiring a professional to do their hair and makeup, scouting a location, planning around the correct weather and lighting, and finally having their composition ready for painting. Yet oftentimes in our own work, we rush through the process of composing in order to just get to the painting and don't allow ourselves nearly the amount of time that our favorite artists take. If posing a model or setting up a still life takes more than 5 or 10 minutes, we start to get antsy. Compare this to artists who spend hours, days, or even weeks planning their masterpiece. So take the time and go through the steps that you need to get your setup all the way to where it needs to be. Adjust your setup until you can see the painting that it's going to turn into. If you realize an object is in the wrong place or is the wrong color, don't just tell yourself that you'll paint the correction. Make the correction in the setup before you sit down to paint. I can't tell you just how commonly I see this, and it's really, really tempting. We can look at the color of a model shirt and say, well, I already have them in the right pose. I don't want to start this whole process over or ask them to do a wardrobe change. I'm just going to paint it red instead of blue. But what we don't factor in are all of these really complex interactions of light and color bouncing around within the composition. And oftentimes when we look at the places in the painting where we just thought, oh, I'll just fix that mentally. I'll do that out of imagination. After all, it's a really simple adjustment. Those tend to be the places in the painting that really don't hold together when you start looking at it with a bit of scrutiny. Now, before we move on, I want to pose one important question about your composition, and that is the arrangement visually confusing? Finally, we get to the one place where I think we can talk about some objective mistakes you'll want to avoid when composing. The first big one is tangents. Tangents occur when two objects in your composition kiss right up against one another, rather than overlapping or having space between them. This happens all the time in real life, but often we're just mobile enough, or we have just enough perspective from having binocular vision that it doesn't feel confusing to our brain. In painting, though, that ambiguity can pull us out from under a painting spell. So instead of enjoying the world an artist has created for us, we begin scrutinizing it and trying to poke holes in it and lose the enjoyment of just looking at the painting because we're trying to understand how it's physically possible. I think you can extrapolate this idea further beyond tangents as well. If you're creating a narrative in your painting, are the key figures and their actions clear? Are there elements that don't belong or look distracting in a way that doesn't serve the ultimate objective of your composition? These are pretty simple ideas, but ones I do see come up often enough that they're worth paying attention to. Thankfully, correcting them is usually a straightforward process and one you should do while you are still in the planning phase, with a simple adjustment of where the key players are placed. Now, as we wrap up, something that's important to remember is that at the end of the day, composition is just about grabbing the viewer's attention and directing it to the part of the painting you want to focus on. That's it. There are many ways to get there, so don't worry about whether or not it's right or you're following the rules. Ask if it's doing the job you want it to do instead, and whether it falls in line with the compositions you are most drawn to. If the painting you're making is doing the job you want, and you're creating the kind of composition you love, that's enough. If you can do those two things, you'll be all set. All right, as always, thank you for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed it. If you're interested in purchasing a painting like this one, I've included a link in the description for you to check out my work. And with that, until next time, happy painting.